Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. Well, she served a decade with the California legislature before turning her focus to the County of Los Angeles. I'm delighted to be joined today by the supervisor for the 2nd District, Supervisor Holly Mitchell. So nice to have you here.
It's wonderful to be with you again. I can't believe it's been so long, so thanks for having me back.
It has. And you're in your 2nd term now, so fabulous.
Yes.
All right, we're just going to get straight to it because there are so many things that I want to talk to you about. But I know, obviously, on top of mind for absolutely everyone in the city and county of Los Angeles is, of course, homelessness. And you've been really working diligently to get a lot of RV encampments moved. So where are you in that process and how are things going?
So the RV encampments has been a fascinating, really kind of learning experience and process. They are focused really in unincorporated areas of LA County. And when we did an assessment, there are like 7,000 countywide, 2,000 of them are in the 2nd District. And so it really has been top of mind of my constituents, small businesses in the 2nd District, and of course my staff and I. And we came up with the motion for the RV encampment removal, which is really kind of a different process than people living on the streets in tents. Pilot program, our goal, we set a goal that we've already exceeded, but to think about the public resources, the number of county departments that are involved, the state agencies that are involved, Department of Motor Vehicles, if they are on the border of a city and unincorporated, the municipal services that are involved. It has really been an incredible feat to watch come together. But I'm very proud because our RV encampment removal motion really led to Pathway Homes and is an integral part of Pathway Homes, which is the county's housing program. Really proud that in relative short order, since we launched it just a year ago, we've removed 200 unsafe recreational vehicles. We've moved 400 individuals into interim housing and about a quarter of that number now into permanent housing. Working collaboratively with community-based organizations, intensive outreach leading up to moving day. But I think that we have found the right process to successfully help people transition out of RVs into first temporary and then permanent supportive housing.
Well, I was going to ask you is that, it's a long process in the fact that, there is that pathway to permanence. But are you worried about more and more and more encampments cropping, up in the while you're working on the ones that you're aware of?
Well, we've done a couple things in this motion. A good number of these RVs have been dismantled.
Oh, okay.
So our goal was to take them out of this kind of a loop feeder system where they go to auction, people we call van lords bid on them, buy them, and then drop them in the street. What we found is sometimes you see the RVs on fire, they've been burned out, and people assume that those were the unhoused people setting them on fire. What we have found is that's a strategy used by the van lords against people who haven't paid rent.
Seriously?
Tragically, so many people who live in these RVs, a good number, don't own them. It's a low rent, if you will, option. And so they're really being preyed upon by these van lords who are renting to them substandard housing.
I had no idea.
And so part of our motion is to get them out of circulation, so I'm very proud of that. We're also working collaboratively with the communities where we've done RV encampment removals to come up with ways in which that stretch of property can change. Sometimes it's painting the curb red, sometimes it's not because it's in front of businesses. So we've talked about working with community to identify beautification strategies, whatever works per community to try to keep that block from having RVs come back. So that plus our effort to dismantle, we're working with dismantlers throughout the county who have been willing to take the RVs that are uninhabitable and inoperable. The RVs that are owned by the residents that may need a new carburetor or their tags brought up to speed, a part of this program is also helping them get their RV up to code, if you will, and continuing to look for safe parking options so people can actually use it, if it's habitable, as a place to reside. So we're working all of those angles. But this landlord and this whole underground economy that the RVs is helping to generate was new information. A part of our team at the county is the fire department arson investigators. They go out as we remove and engage the residents of entire encampments to really say, have you seen fires? And they've been able to track and create and start some arson investigations based on information they found in working collaboratively with the entire county family and the nonprofit organizations around these encampment removals.
Something I was thinking of actually when you were talking is that the clientele that utilize these vans, these RVs, are they uniquely different than the type of clientele that you're finding in tent encampments in places? Have you noticed there's a...
I don't think so. I've talked to lots of women, lots of people with pets.
Okay.
Our first encampment removal, I've had the experience now in 2 instances where an encampment removal community has gone to temporary housing and are now in permanent supportive housing. 2 instances where the county signed a master lease where we leased an entire apartment complex. And so we've been able to move the community together. And so the first one was last November. It was the day before Thanksgiving, I remember. My team and I hosted a lunch, so I got to sit down with those constituents of mine and residents the day they got their key. And I asked, how long have you been living in the encampment? I heard 8 years, 10 years. And my question really was, what will make this transition for you successful? Because we have learned that so many people have gone through this loop of being housed, losing their housing, being housed, losing their housing. And the one thing I learned from that experience was, well, because we're all together and we know each other. And as opposed to an encampment being resolved, using the terminology, or resolution, which means people are moved in different places. On the RV encampment removals, when we do the master leases of these apartments, we try to move people together.
Community.
And it's a ongoing sense of community.
Right.
I think that's important. I have heard, the years I represented the Downtown Women's Center when I was in the state legislature, spending lots of time there, hearing from women about, living on the streets in tents, that how for many of them it felt more safe than in shelters. Mm-hmm. And how they built community, and people felt safe and protected by the people around them in their tent community. And so I think what I've learned from many who've been living in RVs is they felt that same sense of community and safety. And so, we're trying to meet people where they are and acknowledge their needs. If you have pets, can we find housing where you take your pets? If you are a couple, many couples didn't want to go in shelters because they had to be separated. Shelters that accommodate a couple being together are premium in this county. And so I've learned so many reasons why people found themselves in RVs because of their personal choice and life circumstance. And so we're trying to honor and respect that as we find placements to offer them and encourage them to trust us, take a chance on what we're trying to frame and offer, and they've chosen to be housed.
And in this whole scenario, you've been working very closely with Mayor Bass. And how has that bridge between the city and the county afforded some movement forward?
I think even though it may sound, like not a big deal, but when she and my past board chair last year, Janice Hahn, and my current board chair, Supervisor Lindsay Horvath, talk about locking arms, when the mayor declared a state of emergency at the city, Chairwoman Horvath did the same at the county as an effort for us to kind of cut through sometimes bureaucratic red tape to move systems faster. I think the fact that the city of LA and the county have done that on parallel tracks is important. The city's program is Inside Safe. The county's program is Pathway Home. And so they're very similar on similar tracks in terms of really trying to move people into temporary interim housing, and most importantly, permanent supportive housing. And so I think that we're on a parallel track to get people off the streets and inside. Again, from my perspective, meeting their unique needs in terms of the housing infrastructure we build and create to help them stay housed.
Along those lines, I mean, obviously, affordable housing is imperative in all ways, but there's also the issue of rental caps that has been very prominent in terms of, focus. How is that being balanced with the rights of the property owners? They might be, that might be their only property and that is their source of income. So how are you working in that very tough, nuanced scenario?
I appreciate you acknowledging that it is a tough, nuanced scenario, because from my perspective, in the district I have the privilege of representing, mom and pop property owners are really the bread and butter of our affordable housing infrastructure. Through COVID, to hear property owners say, I know my tenants, we work collaboratively. If I can keep them housed by, not going up in the rent and for tenants to say there's some flexibility when it's a mom and pop that I can negotiate, I don't have it all. Can I give you a portion? As opposed to corporations that are kind of on autopilot, and the 3-day pay or quit notice is really on autopilot and it just appears on your door. And tenants who are like, I don't even really know who to call or contact to have a conversation. So the mom and pops are an essential element in preserving our current affordable housing stock. And so you're right. How do we create this balance? I introduced a motion a couple of weeks ago that I think it's as good as it could be, that we struck a balance. And how do I assess that? Because everybody had something negative to say. The tenants felt that the protections weren't enough for them. The mom and pop thought it wasn't enough for them. And basically we are protecting tenants by capping potential increases, but we acknowledged mom and pops and put in increases. I think the tenants' rights people didn't want any increases. They're acknowledging, as the advocates say, the rent in LA County and the state of California is just too damn high. Hearing mom and pops, knowing how they also suffered during COVID, knowing the age of the affordable housing stock in LA County, they need new roofs. We have earthquake retrofitting. We are in a insurance existential or otherwise crisis where it's increasing by leaps and bounds. So acknowledging that. Also, I know if a mom and pop chooses to sell their property, there aren't a lot of mom and pop buyers in the market right now. So I want to protect that mom and pop owner so we don't lose that property to the corporations. So we did do rental increases. We tried to make it within a margin that we thought was fair to protect tenants and their needs, to give mom and pops the option to raise it up to 4%. Luxury apartments, the increase was just 1% more, to really create this balance, to try to meet the needs of everybody. It's not easy in public policy making, but like I said, if we strike a balance where no one feels like they were a winner, it's probably the best policy I could bring forward to the board.
Well, it sounds daunting to say the least, but because you're also dealing with just the basic costs of living, period. So everybody is looking to kind of protect themselves so that they can continue to survive.
And I think the reality I also had to acknowledge is looking at the number of affordable rental units across the unincorporated communities, just under 110,000. Looking at average incomes of people who live in those communities. I want to say the average was like, $61,000 a year. Like 1/3 of that population are earning less than $35,000 a year. So I'm also balancing it against the reality of what people are experiencing in our current economy. It's delicate.
So along those lines, there's a state bill on the docket that funding sober living homes, which kind of goes against what your intent of housing first.
Yes.
So what's the current status of that, and are you in any kind of position at this point to be able to address that on the state level?
Well, it's Assemblymember Haney, who I know very well, and it was brought to my attention, frankly, by the media. I wasn't aware of it. And, I believe I introduced the Housing First bill in 2017, I don't remember what year now, before I left the legislature. And it was based on research about what actually works. prior to Housing First, in some transitional housing facilities, you had to jump through a bunch of hoops in order to validate your worth to be housed. And all the research shows is that housing should be a basic fundamental right, and you can't be expected to deal with your mental health issues or your substance use disorder issues if you're unhoused. Housing First, that gives you a ground in a safe space to then begin to address those issues. And I think that model is working. The issue is for those who choose to run facilities that require drug testing, you just can't use public dollars.
Got it.
I brought that bill up to the legislature during a time where we had just come out of this season that we treated substance use abusers, really with a punitive lens. That if you had a drug conviction, that you couldn't get any kind of public housing benefit. If you had served time in jail for a drug charge, once released, having served your time, there were so many governmental support programs that you weren't qualified for. So how do we expect people to rebound and come back into society and live a different life? And so again, I believe housing is a fundamental right. The issue with this bill that I continue to raise is, I don't want people to lose housing if they have a slip in their sobriety.
Got it.
That shouldn't be the case. And the notion of pulling 25% of the funding out gives me cause for concern also, because I don't know what that number is based on. At a time where we're experiencing a pretty significant deficit in the state budget, where the governor has proposed cuts to our funding for homeless services and programs and housing. And so to carve out a percentage that I don't know that's based on actual need of a diminishing base worries me.
But there are good things happening.
There are,
Okay.
every day.
Every day. So let's talk about some of the successes that you've had. One of your priorities has been and currently is reparations, and there have been some pretty profound things here in the city of Los Angeles that you have spearheaded and have been successful with. How are things progressing in that realm?
So, my real policy priority since I was first elected back in 2010 has really been to look at poverty and what role government can play to create a more equal, equity-based playing field for everybody. The Bruce's Beach example in Manhattan Beach, we realized that family was robbed, frankly, of 100 years of land ownership. And what we know property ownership and home ownership can do for a family in terms of lifting families out of poverty. So my interest in the work that the state did around reparations is really focused on equity and investing in communities that we call in my office unfinished communities, communities that aren't equal to other communities in terms of investment and what that means for the people who live there. We look at what we call underserved communities in a way that we almost blame the people who live there for the conditions in which they live, as opposed to what role did government, did the banking industry, the housing industry, polluters, what role did all these other entities play in not finishing that neighborhood? And so reparations for me is a way to really, again, dig deeply and address the issues of equity, the lack of multi-generational investment in communities and in people who are descendants of the formerly enslaved. And so the state had a reparations task force, an 1,100-page report, and my interest in bringing forward the resolution at the county is to look at what the county can do proactively, much like we looked at the issue around Bruce's Beach, and see if there is a role the county can play. I was intrigued to learn that in 1988, when then President Reagan acknowledged the role government played by interning our Japanese American family, friends, and neighbors, and the role the federal government played. And apparently LA County stepped up too and gave a cash benefit to LA County employees who were Japanese American who lost their jobs because of internment. And so the county has been courageous, I think, in acknowledging past harms and figuring out a way in which we could course correct. So our motion really will be to allow our department, our Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Department, the acronym is ARDI, to begin to investigate and study and figure out if there's a role the county can play in righting past harms.
And along with that, you know, information and education and celebration can be considered part of that whole idea.
Exactly.
And we've all now been introduced to Juneteenth,
yes,
and its importance, and you know why we should pay attention, and that's also been something that you have been really focused on,
yes,
in sharing that kind of history with the whole county. So some of the things that you found to be important and why that is a piece of what you do.
I appreciate that question. First of all, in the reparations motion I just talked about, one immediate aspect of the motion was to acknowledge that Juneteenth, June 19th, is now a federal and state and county holiday, and we wanted to look at county assets. And so on the ARDI website, if you self-attest that you're a descendant of formerly enslaved people, on Juneteenth you have access free of charge to county assets like the Natural History Museum, LACMA, free parking by beaches and harbors at county beaches. So that was an immediate thing we wanted to do in celebration in honor of this year's Juneteenth. Since I was elected to the county, we've had a huge Juneteenth celebration in the 2nd District. And again, we wanted to be very thoughtful about how we do that, to educate and celebrate. And we thought about, you know, Juneteenth is about freedom. We hope people know that it was the formerly enslaved in Galveston, Texas, that didn't find out about the Emancipation Proclamation for a full 2 years after Lincoln signed it, and that was on Juneteenth, 1865. And so it's a celebration of freedom. So I thought about, how do we define freedom today? And so for me, it's bringing county services out of county buildings to community. So at the 2nd District Juneteenth celebration, you have access to record expungement. You have access to information about immigration rights. You have access to information around tenant rights and protections, coupled with literally almost every county department, all 40 of them, plus dozens of community-based organizations who will come out and talk about what freedom looks like in terms of the provision of really important services and information to county residents. And of course, there will be amazing food and amazing experiences with, you know, yoga from Walk Good LA. And if I'm there and there's music, there will always be dancing. And so it's traditional celebration, but also how we define freedom today. And for me as an agent of government at the county level, it's providing and pushing out important services that my constituents can benefit from.
And you mentioned the word expungement, because that's my next question, is that you're also focused on records here in the County of Los Angeles and expunging racially inappropriate language. So how is that going? Is it, I mean, that's a lot of information to go through, and it's not, must be a little disturbing at times to see what's in there.
Well, I have to tell you, my first individual experience with this was looking at the deed of my great aunt's property in the Exposition Park area, a home that she owned for maybe 60 years. And looking at it, because I remember being irritated when I bought my first home actually in Sacramento, and the financing documents referring to me as an unmarried female. And just how language and how women, people of color, between redlining, you know, there's a real storied past about where we could buy, where we couldn't buy, and the role the real estate industry and banking has played in really segregating communities all over this country. And so I'm looking at her deed and see the covenant language. And it was like, this isn't a history book. This is an active document that is in my own family. I was blown away. And so when the state legislation passed, I thought, well, this is a great opportunity for local government to step up to abide by state law.
Sure.
the number of records our registrar recorder told us at LA County that they would have to review, and literally the number of pages, it's in the hundreds of thousands.
Okay.
I think it's important. As a lot of our conversation has taken place, that there's concern about erasure of history. And if it's just in this old document, Holly, that was then, this is now. But, if you don't know our history, if we don't address history, we often fall victim to repeating that history. And so I think it's an important opportunity to not only, stand up to state law, but for the largest county in the union to go through the process of scrubbing racist words that were used to describe a people out of our official documents, because they do still exist.
Which is terrifying to think about. But okay, we're going to run out of time here, and I just want you to stay all afternoon so we could talk forever. But I do want to ask you, looking towards the future, there's lots of preparations for 2028 for the Olympics and the Paralympics, et cetera. What are you working on particularly with the 2nd District?
So when it really hit me, 2028 is really around the corner.
Yes.
And
don't sit here too long.
It is. And I lived through the Summer Olympics that were here in Los Angeles, and remembered all of the kind of fear and apprehension we all had. And then
fabulous.
Thank you, Mayor Bradley. It was an incredible experience. I remember being at the closing ceremonies. I think I was a senior and undergrad. I just remember it clearly. And now I'm sitting at the seat of government, and so now I'm overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of it all. I sit on the Coliseum Commission. A number of the cities I have the privilege of representing have amazing facilities and stadiums that will be impacted. SoFi, in Carson. And so really wanting to have a seat at the table to make sure that while the city of LA is driving the car, it's a whole bunch of people in the car that weren't a part of some of those initial negotiations.
Okay.
I introduced a motion, thank you Supervisor Solis for co-authoring it with me, to really put front and center, let's talk about the economic impact it can or should, I'll say, have on LA County, just to make sure that we're a part of the conversation. We want employment opportunities for our county residents. We want to make sure that our infrastructure is invested in to be able to stand up, literally, the millions of people from all over the world who will be coming to participate in and watch the games. We heard from the Olympic organization that they weren't going to build new buildings. We've got the stadiums. They built Olympic Village for athlete housing at UCLA all those years ago. But we've also heard that they're going to have a no-car zone. I serve in the Metro Board, and so it's like, well, what does that mean? Do we have the appropriate infrastructure in like an adequate number of buses to move people from point A to point B? So I have more questions now than answers, but I know Mayor Bass is paying close attention. I know the mayors and the other civic leaders of the other impacted cities from Inglewood to Carson and many others are paying close attention. And I have a responsibility to also have a seat at the table, recognizing the number of unincorporated communities I represent who will be impacted as well. So, Metro's got to be at the table, Coliseum Commission's got to be at the table, but looking at workforce development and what kind of investments can stay behind. LA 84 is still providing resources to young people across this county for them to be able to engage in athletic experiences. So we want to make sure that there are resources left behind to support people who call LA County home during the Olympics and beyond.
So if people want to follow all of these things that you are doing, what's the best way for them to be able to watch all of the things that you're participating in?
My county website, which is mitchell.lacounty.gov, and Holly J. Mitchell on all other social media platforms.
Well, Supervisor Mitchell, this is absolutely fascinating. And promise me that you'll come back, because when you first were here, you had just started and it was the pandemic. Lots has changed, and we can't wait to really learn what other things you're doing in the future.
I appreciate it. I'd love to come back.
And that's a wrap on this LA Currents.